somewhere north of the Finger Lakes in the country at the center of the Six Nations Longhouse. The old accounts describe an army that could not be killed with an arrow, skin like stone, twice the height of a man. Bodies that no flint point could open, no matter how hard a warrior drew the bow. They came south out of the cold for one reason. They came to eat. They emptied whole towns. They hunted at night and hid by day. The old accounts say they even understood the language of the people they hunted, that you could not outtalk them any more than you could outrun them. For years, by every record that survives, there was no defense against them at all. Every version of the story agrees on that part. Where it gets strange is what happened next. Because according to the two oldest written records of this tradition, the invasion that should have ended the Five Nations instead ended, almost entirely, in a single morning. One trick, one landslide, and one survivor, who the story says is still out there. This is what got written down 100 years apart, by two men from two different nations who had no reason to agree with each other, and it still hasn't been fully explained. The first man to put any of this on paper was Tuscarora, not Seneca or Onondaga. David Cusick published his Sketches of Ancient History of the Six Nations around 1827 in his own English by his own hand, the first book-length history of the Haudenosaunee written by a Haudenosaunee person. Cusick was not a folklorist collecting stories from someone else. He was recording what his own people held as history, and he treated the stone giants exactly the way he treated everything else in the book, as an event with a before and an after, not a fable. Almost 100 years later came the second major record. Arthur Parker, a Seneca ethnologist, had grown up hearing these stories as a child, long before he trained as an archaeologist and folklorist. In 1923, he published Seneca Myths and Folk Tales, dozens of accounts set down from memory, in close to the words he'd actually heard them in as a boy. One of them is titled simply The Stone Giants. Cusick and Parker never worked together. They wrote for different reasons in different centuries from different nations inside the same confederacy, and their accounts of what happened converge on the same enemy, the same trick, and the same place. Parker's version explains what the stone giants actually were, or at least what his own people believed they were. A race from a distant country in the far north where the winters never really ended. As children, the story goes they were made to rub coarse sand into their skin every day until it wore through and scarred, year after year until by adulthood their bodies were armored like a stretched, calloused hide that no flint arrowhead could open. Some who told the story thought the giants did this to themselves, deliberately, generation after generation. Others said they were simply born that way. A different kind of people entirely, not men who had changed. Either telling ends at the same place. Warriors shot their best arrows, tipped with the hardest flint they had, and the shafts snapped and the points shattered against skin that did not break. Cusick is direct about what that meant for the people living through it. Towns emptied outright. Settlements moved rather than face another raid. His account says plainly that the Five Nations could not increase while the raids went on, a population that couldn't grow, because it kept losing people to something arrows couldn't touch. What ends it, in both records, is not a battle, it's a lie. The story's central figure, called the Holder of the Heavens in Cusick's telling, takes the shape of a stone giant himself and walks into their camp. He is convincing enough, or powerful enough, that they make him their leader. Parker's version has him staging a full performance, taking command, swinging a war club over his head, promising his new followers a great feast such as never before if they'll follow him one more day's march. Cusick, writing separately almost a century earlier, gives nearly identical logistics. The giants are marching to attack a fortified Onondaga stronghold, and their new chief orders them to lie hidden in a deep hollow overnight, ready to strike at dawn. At first light, instead of leading the attack, he climbs above them, and he brings the hillside down. Cusick's line is almost matter-of-fact about it. He overwhelms them by a mass of rocks, and only one escaped. Parker's independent telling has the same shape and the same outcome. The caves the giants were sheltering in collapse under a shaken hillside, and every giant but one is crushed where he hid. Parker adds a detail, Cusick doesn't, that for generations afterward people said you could still find bones in those Onondaga caves. Whether that detail is remembered fact, folk elaboration, or something in between is not something either record can settle from the page. And it's worth being honest that no modern excavation has ever confirmed a mass grave tied to this specific story. What's verifiable is narrower, and in its own way just as interesting. Two Haudenosaunee writers, a century apart from different nations within the same confederacy, describing the same disguise, the same overnight ambush, the same collapsing hillside, arriving from different directions at the same ending. This isn't everything Cusick wrote down either. He goes on to say the giants weren't wiped out completely, that for years afterward. Small numbers of them still turned up in the far north, diminished, but very few found in the north regions, raiding hunting parties that strayed too far. He even records a single strange encounter, an Onondaga hunter taken prisoner by one of the survivors and forced to run a race against him for his life. It's a small detail, almost a footnote, But it tells you something about how this history was held, not as a single clean ending, but as a threat that faded out slowly, over years, rather than stopping all at once. But both accounts agree that the main army, the one that nearly ended the Five Nations, was destroyed in that single morning. And both agree that one of them got away. Parker's telling follows him specifically. Fleeing south with what the story calls the speed of a being impelled by the evil-minded, he reaches the Allegheny Mountains and finds a cave, and stays in it so long, in the dark, that he stops being what he was and becomes something else. A solitary figure the Seneca called Genonsqua, not a race anymore, just one. The story gives him a single vulnerable point on the underside of his foot and says his rage never fully left him, that in later years, a hunter caught out in a mountain storm might stumble into a cave for shelter, only to hear a voice in the dark demand to know who had entered his lodge without permission. Thunder in that country was sometimes explained the same way as Janonsqua hearing the sky rumble, remembering the morning the hillside came down, and quarreling with it. He is never drawn here as anything but what the story itself frames him as, a figure the tellers kept alive in memory, about something they treated as gone from the world. This isn't the first time this exact shape has come up on this channel. A film about the Choctaws Naniwaya described the Naholo the same way. Too strong, too different, met in open war and gone. Another, about the Cherokees Utlunta, showed the same story doing something even stranger, turning up independently in the Cherokees' own neighbors, the Haudenosaunee and the Choctaw, nations that were not exchanging these stories with each other. That film used the Haudenosaunee stone giants as one comparison point among several. This time, the stone giants are the whole story, and the version inside their own confederacy turns out to carry its own internal corroboration. One Tuscarora writer and one Seneca writer, 100 years apart, independently landing on the same enemy, the same trick, the same hillside. None of this proves stone-skinned giants raided the Finger Lakes region. It proves that two Haudenosaunee writers from different nations, a century apart, chose to record the same story as history rather than fable, and that whatever sat underneath that choice was real enough to both of them to write down almost exactly the same way. The land the story is set in is not in dispute, at least. Onondaga country sits on genuinely dramatic ground. Limestone ridges cut through with real caves and hollows, the kind of landscape you'd set a hiding army in if you were building the story from scratch. No specific hollow has ever been identified as the one in the account. That isn't a loose end this film can tie up, and it isn't going to pretend otherwise. What isn't a loose end is who still holds that ground. The Onondaga Nation is the firekeeper of the Confederacy, the nation that has hosted its central council fire since before any of this was written down, and it survives today as a sovereign nation on part of its own homeland, just south of Syracuse near a town called Nedro. It is not the land it once held. Between 1788 and 1822, New York State took roughly 95% of it through a series of purchases the nation has spent decades in court arguing were illegal, and that fight over the same ground this story is set on is still active today. The story of a hillside that once saved the Five Nations and the story of a homeland that shrank to a fraction of itself afterward are not the same story, but they happen to the same people, on the same land, and it seems worth saying both. What's left, then, is what was actually written down. A people who in their own oldest histories remembered facing something no ordinary weapon could touch, and remembered, just as clearly, that it ended, not with a war won by strength, but with a lie good enough to walk an enemy onto ground that could be brought down on top of them. Whether Janongswa is anything more than a story the Seneca kept to explain a thunderstorm is an open question, and no one alive can close it. What isn't open to question is that two different nations wrote down the same ending, a century apart, without checking each other's work first.